Good evening. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's really great to be back in Santa Cruz. People sometimes say when they see me in different parts of the state, are you running for office statewide? The answer is no, absolutely not. I love representing San Francisco and Saratoga County, but I think it's incredibly important when you're at a state level making policy for the state to be present and to talk to people in different parts of the state and to try to understand what's going on around the state. We have a lot of commonality in California, a lot of common problems, and but it's just good to really talk to different communities. So thank you for having me. I also just want to say thank you for sending two fantastic representatives to the legislature in Bill Monning and Mark Stone. I work with both of them a lot. They're true, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in Santa Cruz. They are two of the most thoughtful legislators that I've worked with, and I really want to say thank you. And it's great to have my good friend John Laird here tonight to join us. So I think a lot of times when it comes to housing, we get caught up with a lot of lingo and technical terms, and we have our debates, and these terms, they're important. We talk about things like zoning and CEQA and streamlining, local control and state control, and housing elements and RENA, and all of these terms of art about housing, prevailing wage, project labor agreements, and these terms are of course important. But I always try to encourage people when we're talking about housing not to get too caught up in these terms and to take a step back and look at the human side of housing, because that's what it's about. It's about the real live human beings living in Santa Cruz or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Eureka or wherever else who are struggling with housing. I'm one of the lucky ones. I was fortunate enough, I'm pushing 50, and I was fortunate enough back in my 30s to be able to purchase a small condo in the Castro, my neighborhood in San Francisco, and so I feel very lucky. But there are a lot of people who are not so lucky, and that's what this is about. When we look at the fact that 1 in 20 school children in the state of California is homeless, 1 out of 20. And that should be I think viewed by all of us as a moral outrage. In Santa Cruz County, it's over 8%. In Monterey County, it's 10%. 1 out of 10 or even more CSU students is homeless. I saw a recent study estimating that statewide, 19% of community college students are homeless. We have this huge and growing homeless population overall, including a rapidly growing, I believe the fastest growing demographic is seniors of homeless people, and by far the largest number of unsheltered homeless people in the country. We are half of all unsheltered homeless people in the country live in California. We have a situation where because of our approach to housing over the last 50 years, where we've deprioritized it and not built nearly enough housing, we have young people who are simply unable to get a foothold. Young people who can't envision a future for themselves in their community because they can't envision a scenario where they will have stable long-term housing. We have young families who maybe they can make a go of it when they have the first kid who's 6 months or 1 year old, but once that kid is running around, and once they have a second kid, they're out, because there's nowhere for them in terms of having adequate housing for a growing family in their community that they can even hope to afford, and so they leave. We have people being evicted and displaced, having to leave their community because there is nowhere where they can possibly hope to afford. And so this is a real problem just for the basics of existing as a human being in a community, having actual housing, because we don't have enough of it. There are also the economic and environmental consequences of our approach to housing. When we look at the sprawl has been an instrumental part of California housing policy in the past 50 years. We've announced we're not going to let you build enough housing near jobs, near transit, in the urbanized areas, so you just build further and further out, cover up the farmland, cover up the open space, clog the freeways, increase carbon emissions, and we are undermining our own climate goals with the 40% carbon emissions and growing from transportation. And then, of course, the economic side of it. Sometimes people say, we want the tech companies to go away, or there's too many jobs. You hear that, too many jobs. Well, we are, I'll tell you, over time, we're going to see a natural pushing away of jobs, not because people are saying, please go away, but because employers increasingly are choosing not to expand in California, not because of the taxes, not because of the regulations, but because their workers can't find housing. In San Francisco, we are seeing, there was recently a very, very popular, excellent restaurant called Farmer Brown that closed down. Not for lack of business, not for poor quality food, not for taxes, but because they couldn't maintain a workforce. They could not hire enough servers and cooks and keep them because they couldn't afford housing. And we're starting to see that happen, and that's in San Francisco now, but trust me, San Francisco is the tip of the sword in a bad way when it comes to housing. And what we see in San Francisco starts to happen elsewhere, and we're seeing that already. And for these small businesses and other businesses, it's a problem. So how do we get here? How do we get to the point where in California we have a 3.5 million home deficit? We are short 3.5 million homes, which, to put that in context, if you take the other 49 states combined and add up their housing deficits, it's just about 3.5 million homes. Our housing deficit in California is approximately equal to the other 49 states combined. That is extraordinary. How did we get here? And we got here not because, sometimes people like to demonize local elected officials or demonize people who have opinions about what happens in their neighborhood. This is not about demonizing. We're all subject to criticism for anything we do, whether we're someone who's testifying at a planning commission meeting or we're a city council member, but it's not about that. It's about a system, frankly, that is designed to not produce enough housing. A system that is designed to fail, and that is failing, but we can fix it. So this system that we have of how we approach housing in California was mostly mostly created in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Well, let's look. 1960, California had 15 million people. 1970, it had about 20 million people. 1980, it had about 24 million people. And that's when we created the modern California approach to housing. We have, of course, 40 million now. We're heading towards 50. And so that system that we set up for a dramatically smaller state is as follows. Even though cities have always had control over zoning in California, until the 1960s, zoning was very permissive in most places. There was not, for the most part, restrictive zoning that said you can only build one kind of housing, single-family home. That's the only thing you're allowed to build. And you see in a lot of parts of the state, in LA and San Francisco, all over the state, it built in the first half of the 20th century until the 60s or 70s, all sorts of types of housing, single-family homes, apartment buildings, 3-unit buildings, 7, 20-unit buildings, all over. And then, starting in the 1960s, and into the 70s and the 80s, cities across California downzoned and said, we're not going to let you build apartments anymore. We're going to ban all forms of housing except for single-family homes or maybe 2-unit buildings. To the point where in San Francisco, Little San Francisco, the major job center, 70% of the land in San Francisco is zoned either single family or 2-unit. It's illegal to even build a 3-unit building in 70% of San Francisco. The same is true in Los Angeles, and the same is true in many parts of the state. In fact, 80% of the residentially zoned land in California is zoned single family, or maybe some of it 2-unit. So that didn't just happen. It didn't happen for the most part 100 years ago. That wasn't like ingrained into the DNA of California from 1850. That was instituted in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It happened mostly in San Francisco in the 70s, early 80s. In LA, it happened, I believe, in 1985. I don't know when it happened in Santa Cruz. I'm sure someone can figure that out. But it happened when we had a lot fewer people. We also, in the early 70s, passed a law called CEQA that Ronald Reagan signed. CEQA is an incredibly important law. Some people want to get rid of CEQA and blame CEQA for everything. I'm not one of those people. I think CEQA serves incredibly important purposes. But over time, CEQA was deemed to apply to infill housing in urbanized areas, and there were court interpretations saying that if you're building some 4-unit apartment building next to a subway station, CEQA applies to that, and you can get sued under CEQA and so forth. And so on top of that, of course, the cities will sometimes say, well, you have to change CEQA because CEQA is hurting our ability to deliver housing. But of course, CEQA only applies if the city decides that its permits are discretionary. Cities have it within their power to have ministerial permits that don't trigger CEQA at all. But more and more cities decided to make their housing approval process subjective and discretionary with conditional use permits and discretionary appeals. And so that we would see even projects that are within zoning, within local zoning, take 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years to get approved. That wasn't the case in the 1950s or in 1900 or in 1850. That happened starting really in the 70s. So that was a new thing when California had 15, 17 million people. So we took all these steps in California to create the modern approach to housing in California. Hyper low density zoning, usually banning every form of housing other than single family homes, banning apartment buildings, banning affordable housing, banning senior housing, banning student housing, banning it all, saying the only kind of home you're allowed to build in our city or in the bulk of our city is a single family home. We made that decision. You can imagine in LA, when they did that, when they downzoned, they eliminated 50%, 1/2 of their zone housing capacity in one fell swoop. And that's what happened across the state. And then on top of it, we're going to make it really hard and expensive and long for you to get any housing approved, even if it's within zoning. So we set up this system, and maybe that system worked well when we had 15 or 20 million people in California. It doesn't work with 40 million people. And the results are some of the results I described before. The cost of housing is driving people in poverty and into homelessness. It's driving young families out. It's pushing people into 2-hour commutes. The super commuters who are commuting from Manteca into San Francisco or San Bernardino into LA and spending 3.5, 4 hours or more on the road every day with the carbon emissions and messing up their back and getting home at 9 o'clock at night when their kid's already in bed. That's what we've created, and that's the impact. So how do we fix it? And that's what we're focused on now. And again, it's not just about, some people just like to berate local elected officials. Just do your job. Well, as a former local elected official who understands what it's like to get yelled at in the supermarket by someone who's upset about a development or a parking situation or whatever, and I had to have a recall petition taken out against you, although I had that taken out for a different reason, about public nudity in San Francisco. That was my attempted recall against me. It wasn't about housing. Local elected officials are overwhelmingly people who just want to serve their community, who overwhelmingly are not getting paid, maybe they're getting paid nothing, or they're getting paid a tiny amount of money to devote a huge part of their life to their community, and that's why they're in it, for the right reason. But we have set up local governments to fail. Because what we said is, okay, we want you to build housing, we're gonna set housing goals for you, we're gonna make you do planning, and guess what, city council members? Every Monday afternoon or Wednesday morning or every other week when you meet, you're gonna walk the plank and vote for these projects and have any of the blowback that happens as a result. And we've given our city council members really little or no cover, because we have a system of pure local control in California, where we basically say, it's all on you. We as a state are either going to pass no housing laws or housing laws that have no teeth, and you do it. Now, this form of pure local control for cities is fairly unique when it comes to housing. When you think of an issue as what are some of the issues of the magnitude of housing? Housing is a huge part of human existence. Let's talk about public education. If I came in and said, I have a great piece of legislation I want you to endorse, I love local control so much that I want our school districts to be able to decide how many days a year they educate kids. If they want to do it only 30 or 40 days a year, that's their choice. I want them to be able to decide what subjects they teach. If they don't want to teach math anymore, local control. I want them to decide whether they hire credentialed teachers, local control. Because they know best, they're in local government, they should make these choices. You would laugh me out of the room if I proposed that legislation to you. We can have a debate about what kind of education standards, but the state plays a role and sets standards. Same with healthcare. And that's what, in my view, we need to get to with housing. Not a state takeover of local land use. I don't advocate that. I don't think that that would work. But having standards in place and basic rules within which local control operates. To understand that housing is a statewide issue. That this 3.5 million home gap, this massive gap, it's a daunting one when you think about it. That this isn't going to get solved with the system that we've had for the last 50 years, and we will continue to set ourselves up for failure. And in the end, most people who understand, because we see it in the polls in California, that housing and homelessness are consistently the top issues in California when you ask it in a poll, which wasn't the case 10 years ago. It was in certain regions, but not statewide. Now it's consistently the top two issues statewide. So Californians want it to be addressed. They want their elected officials to do something about it and to fix it. And for most Californians, they don't really care if the person who's fixing it is the person where they check the box next to their name on the ballot under the line city council or mayor, or if it's the person they voted for under the line assembly member or senator. That's not relevant to most people. They know that they've elected people to fix problems, and they want the problems fixed. So for people who say the state should have no role on housing, and there are even some people who are talking about a constitutional amendment to kick the state out of housing. You look at fair housing laws and other kinds of laws that the state has been criticized by local governments for in the past. We can have that debate. But the reality is, in my point of view, the state has to have a role if we're going to fix this problem and not have all those kids homeless, living in cars or shelters, and allow young families to actually have a chance in the state. So we are, this year, in the last few years, we have been doing, I think, some strong legislation around housing. For example, for 35 years, it's been the law in California that cities are required to allow people to put ADUs or in-law units in their homes. That's been the law since the early 80s. And overwhelmingly, cities, including my own, San Francisco, have ignored that law. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the legislature has been putting teeth into that law. You say, when we say you have to allow people to put ADUs if they want to, we mean it. We have a law also passed in the early 1980s called the Housing Accountability Act, that prohibits cities from arbitrarily rejecting or chopping in half or otherwise watering down projects that are within zoning. And that's happened everywhere. The city does its general plan and says, this parcel is zoned for 100 units. And then when the project comes up, we say, well, we know we said that in our zoning and our general plan, that we said it was 100 units. We're going to let you have 27 units. The Housing Accountability Act makes that illegal. There were no teeth in the law. We have put teeth in the law to make sure that it is enforced. The state density bonus, which says to developers, if you do a certain level of affordability, you can have more density and even more height than local zoning allows. That law was passed, I think it was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, and in recent years it's been strengthened because most cities were ignoring it and refusing to implement it. It's now being implemented, and it's generating a lot of housing and a lot of affordable housing in particular. The state is finally getting back into the business of funding affordable housing for lower income residents. For a long time, the federal government was withdrawing, and California was withdrawing, including killing off redevelopment, which was abused in some instances, but was also in many places creating a lot of affordable housing. In the last few years, we've significantly increased the state investment in affordable housing because it's not enough to just tell cities, you shall build affordable housing. We need to partner with cities in providing that funding. We're also, I think we need to understand that while larger cities often have a big planning department and can do all of the work that needs to be done to update general plans, to update zoning, to have objective design standards and so forth, a lot of smaller cities in California don't have those resources. May only have a planning department of one person, may not have any capacity to do that work. The state is now providing significant funding to smaller cities to help them beef up their planning operations to be able to do good planning work. We're also, I think this year we may finally see some progress in increasing tenant protections in California. The legislature has not been a hospitable place to pro-renter pieces of legislation for a long time. I think there's finally momentum to do something and move the dial because so many renters in this state, up and down the state, are struggling and getting hit with massive rent increases. And it's not just in apartments. A significant percentage of the single-family homes in California are renter-occupied. And so these renters need more protections. We are doing more and more streamlining in California to say that projects, that housing should move faster, that approvals should not be taking years and years and years. A bill that I authored in 2017, Senate Bill 35, that provides that for communities that are not meeting their Wiener goals, their housing goals, they become streamlined, meaning they can do objective design review, but they have to approve the project. And we were able to get good environmental and labor support for that bill, and it is turning into a real engine for affordable housing approvals in particular. And then, yes, we are looking at zoning reform, and that is Senate Bill 50, which I don't want to say I'm authoring, we're authoring. We have 16 co-authors of the bill. My name is first, but there are 15 other members from every region of the state, from north to south, from coastal inland. We have both Democrats and Republicans, senators and assembly members, a broad cross-section of the legislature ranging from some of the most lefty Democrats to some of the most conservative Republicans, because housing is not a partisan issue. And I've learned that firsthand, that there are Democrats and Republicans on both sides of this issue. This is an issue that affects red districts and blue districts and purple districts equally, and we all have to work together. And so Senate Bill 50 will set basic zoning standards in areas near public transportation and job centers to get at that issue that I mentioned before, where we have banned all housing other than single-family homes, even in our job and transit centers. And that is a way of ensuring that we're not going to fill that deficit, and that to the extent we do, we're going to do it by sprawl, building in wildfire zones, farmland, etc. Excuse me. And so the bill, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about some aspects of the bill. The bill largely preserves local control. Individual projects will continue to go through the same approval process they go through today, conditional use, CEQA, whatever the case may be. Cities will continue to be able to have their own design review standards. Cities can continue to restrict demolitions in whatever way they choose. Cities can continue to require whatever impact fees they have in place. Local height limits will mostly apply around bus stops and job centers. It defers to local height limits, and local setback rules will apply. But in one respect, this will change local practice, and that is if you're within a half a mile of a fixed rail ferry stop, if you're within a quarter mile of a high-frequency bus stop, has to run frequently from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. During the week, and on the weekends from, I believe it's 8 to 8. And in job centers, you can't limit density. You can't say, we're going to put a cap on the number of units. The cap will be dictated by the building code, which puts a natural limit on density. And then the bill also provides that within that half-mile radius around rail or ferry, the height limit can't be pushed below either 4 stories or 5 stories. And in a lot of communities, there's already a 40-foot or even a 50-foot height limit. And if it's a 30-foot height limit, then you're talking about a 1 or 2-story increase. We have taken a lot of input, constructive feedback over the past year, and made a lot of changes to the bill. There used to be an 8-story option, we took that out. We made bus stops subject to local height limits. That was a change as well in response to feedback about buses. We put much stronger tenant protections in the bill this year. So if there's been Ellis Act eviction on the property in the last 15 years, the bill doesn't apply to that property. If a tenant has resided on the property at any point in the last 7 years, you can't demolish it under this bill to build a new building. We don't want this to become a way of evicting tenants in order to build new housing. The bill also defers to local inclusionary, and in any city that has an inclusionary housing ordinance to require X percentage of units have to be affordable to low-income people. This will result in an increase in those below market rate affordable units. Because if you have low-density zoning on a parcel, you will have no affordable housing there because it won't trigger your inclusionary ordinance. There's no such thing as a below-market rate single-family home, or it's extremely rare if there is. But now you can build a small apartment building, it will trigger your inclusionary ordinance. It will allow 100% affordable projects to be built in more places because single-family zoning, you can't build affordable housing there. If it's multi-unit, you can. So the legislation will have a lot of benefits. I know there's a lot of conversation and controversy around it, and frankly, whatever side people fall on, I hope that everyone is on some level happy that we're finally having an intense conversation about it. And this is an intense and hard conversation, but it matters. It matters. And if people are now having those arguments are often a healthy thing when it comes to important issues. And I'm hopeful that we come out in a better place. We have a new governor who has made clear that housing is among his top priorities. And I think we're going to see some good things come out of the legislature this year. I look forward to working with folks in Santa Cruz and other parts of the state. We'll continue to have an open door to constructive feedback about this bill or anything else, because there are a lot of housing issues percolating in the legislature. And I want to end by thanking Santa Cruz YIMBY and the Santa Cruz County Business Council for hosting tonight. But I want to give a real shout out to the YIMBY movement. And it's an interesting thing because in recent years, some people have taken to trying to demonize the people who are YIMBYs and all sorts of aspersions and accusations. And if you're not being attacked and criticized, it means you're not doing anything. But the reality is that I took office in local government in 2011. And in my first few years in the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, where trust me, we have some really intense debates about development issues. We would have hearings on significant projects, and the only people who would really show up in favor of the projects were mostly people who were related to the project in some way, and maybe a couple of neighbors who thought it was a good idea. And then you would have a lot of opponents there. When the YIMBY movement started, and it did start in San Francisco, but it quickly spread all over the state, all of a sudden we started having people showing up at hearings, not only young people, but mostly young people. I know YIMBYs who are in their 70s and 80s and who are extremely passionate about the cause, but particularly young people who would show up and say, what is my future? And what are we doing to make sure that I have a housing future here? And that was a voice that had been missing in our housing debates for so long. And it's such a welcome addition, whatever people think about any given issue, so that we can have a debate that truly reflects the broad perspectives and needs of our community. And I do believe that the YIMBY movement has fundamentally changed the housing debate in California, both at a local level, but also at a statewide level. And I want to say thank you to everyone who is part of that movement, and everyone who is an ally to that movement. And also thank you to everyone who might disagree with me on this, that, or the other issue, for being involved and for engaging in the process. So thank you for tonight, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you again, Senator, for coming out tonight. We've collected some questions from the audience on these cue cards here. We still have some. If you bring them up, if someone gets some of those cards. Probably have time for about 3 questions. I've done my best to distill the kind of the general themes of a lot of similar questions to hopefully get at some of the major concerns that people have. So, first one.
And I'm happy to do a few more of those for you. I want to pick your time, but I'm not interrupting you.
Okay, great. So the first question, I believe, is in relation to SB50. And it wants to talk about how the legislation specifically addresses affordable housing, not just market rates. So how does SB50 address affordable housing?
Sure. So SB50 addresses both what we call market rate housing and affordable housing, which affordable housing means a lot of different things to many people, but when I say affordable housing, I'm referring to income restricted below market rate housing. So housing has a subsidy in it, so it's going to be affordable to people within a certain income spectrum, usually lower income or very low income or extremely low income, so that they are paying no more than 30% of their income for that housing. Market rate housing, which is sometimes dismissed as quote unquote luxury housing because it's expensive. Of course, homes that are 100 years old are also obscenely expensive right now. So while there is such a thing as luxury housing, I can show you some examples in San Francisco of the hyper fancy buildings with attendants out front and all personalized everything. Most of the new housing that's going up is not luxury housing, it's just new housing, and it's really expensive, just like the old housing is, because we don't have enough of it. And in my view, when you talk about the subsidized below market rate housing and whatever we want to call it, market rate, privately produced, those regular, not income restricted housing, they're both critically important. For our low-income residents, even though the market used to produce housing that was affordable for low-income people, it's not right now, and I don't see that happening in the near future. Hopefully one day we'll get back to that. But we have to have a lot of subsidized affordable housing for our low-income residents because the market is not producing that housing. For our middle class, we are never, I would say never, we can have a total shift in our society and have socialized housing for everyone, and there are people advocating for that, and that'll be a continuing discussion. But in the foreseeable future, we're not going to subsidize our way out of our middle-class housing problem. It's too big, the resources are not there, and what would end up happening is we would have resources diverted from low income to subsidize the middle class. For our middle class, we're going to solve that problem by having a dramatic increase in the supply of housing. So we have to have both. And SB50 does both. It will legalize significantly more housing overall by allowing more multi-unit housing near transit and jobs. And it will increase affordable housing in two ways. First, as I mentioned before, let's say you are a city where your inclusionary housing ordinance is triggered by 10 units. That's how we do it in San Francisco. Some cities it's triggered at 5, some it might be 15 or 20, but whatever that threshold is, if you have parcels that are zoned only for single family, that will never produce an affordable unit under an inclusionary ordinance. If you are zoned now that you can build 5 or 10 or 15, 20 units on that parcel, it will trigger your inclusionary ordinance. So you will see more affordable units under existing inclusionary ordinances. In addition, as I mentioned before, for nonprofits that are building 100% affordable housing, they can only do that if the property is zoned multi-unit. They're not going to build affordable single-family homes. And so when you take parcels where affordable housing is now essentially illegal because it's zoned single-family, and say you can build a small to mid-sized multi-unit building, that will become a candidate for affordable housing for 100%. And that is why one of the sponsors of our bill is the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, NPH. NPH is the umbrella organization for affordable housing organizations in Northern California, including all or almost all of the nonprofit affordable housing builders, the Mercy Housing, Bridge Housing, all the nonprofits that build affordable housing. They're part of this umbrella group called Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. They are one of the, not just supporter of SB50, they're one of our sponsors. And they're doing it because they know that SB50 will result in a dramatic increase in affordable housing. I want to just end by mentioning, I mentioned SB35, the housing streamlining bill that I offered 2 years ago. The critiques that are being leveled now against SB50, quite a few of them, are identical to the critique that we heard about SB35. It's going to be terrible for affordable housing. It's going to be terrible for tenants. Mass evictions everywhere. Mass demolitions everywhere. It was never true. And in the several years that SB35 has been in effect, it's resulted overwhelmingly in more affordable housing than market rate housing. And so I think that we're going to see people who are skeptical of SB50 if it passes, and it's always a hard road, I think are going to be pleasantly surprised with the type of housing that it leads to.
Okay, thank you so much, Senator Wiener. So there's been a lot of questions submitted that are related to traffic and water, as you can imagine. In particular, people who are referring that local jurisdictions know best about their limited resources. How would you respond to that when we talk about the shift from local to state control?
Yeah, so let's look at, I do not agree with the notion that building housing is what increases population. And the proof is in the pudding. I mentioned to you before, so California, if you look at housing production in California, it basically tailed off in the 1960s. Back in up until the 50s into the 60s, we were building an enormous amount of housing. In the early 60s, California built 300,000 units of housing a year. Now we build about 80,000, even though we're a much bigger state. 300,000 units a year in the early 1960s. So we were building a ton of housing, and then we stopped. So between, say, at some point in the 60s until pretty recently, I'm not saying we weren't, of course we were building housing in California, but it really dropped dramatically. And what happened to our population as our housing production spiraled downwards? It went from 15 million to 20 million to 23 million to 30 million to 40 million today. So we reduced the amount of housing that we're building per year by 75%. By 75%. And our population is now almost 3 times bigger than it was in 1960. So people moved to California because this is by far not just the best of the 50 states, but it's the best place on earth. And it's true in so many respects. And people have been coming here for 170 years because of what California stands for, because this has been a place of innovation and creativity and risk-taking and art. And you look at who's been coming here, you know, the LGBT. Why did I move to San Francisco in 1997 from New Jersey? And there are people who love telling me, go back to New Jersey. I moved here in 1997 to San Francisco because I was a young gay man trying to find my community. The same reason that the hippies moved here, the same reason that artists have moved here, that actors have moved here, that farmers moved here. People have moved here forever because of what California is. And I'm actually inspired that when I do a local art show in my office every few months where we do a theme and we have local artists show, usually 15 or 20 local artists because we have a large space so we can do that with. And it is inspiring to me that even though the average rent now in San Francisco is $3,600 a month, it's horrible, it's a nightmare, that the artists find a way to be there. And I'm not just talking about older artists who have owned a home for 50 years. I'm talking about young people who find a way to be here. Young people and people who are struggling, seniors who are struggling, will find a way to be in California. And so our choice is, do we build enough housing for them or not? So in terms of our infrastructure, traffic, water, everything else, the people are already here. They've been moving here for a long time despite not building enough housing. And so whatever strain is being put on our infrastructure, and we're making that strain worse, by the way, by causing sprawl, because it's much more inefficient to deliver water to unending sprawl than it is to do it in a concentrated area. San Francisco has the lowest per capita water use in the state. It's half the statewide average. That's not just a coincidence. It's partly because when you have that level of density, delivering power to sprawl is more expensive. Building more and more roads for sprawl is more expensive. So it's more efficient when we have infill density. And so our choice is not whether to have more housing, more population growth. People do what they're going to do. It's about, are we going to have enough housing for the people, frankly, who are already here and who are already coming here. We have to do more for infrastructure. We've been doing more. We as a state, the legislature passed the largest transportation funding measure in California history, SB1. One of my colleagues got recalled over that vote. And that is $5.2 billion a year in new funding for transportation. There's more and more local and regional measures. We have put a lot more money into our water infrastructure, as Secretary Laird knows. We are making investments. The voters have been unbelievably generous in voting for bonds, and we have to keep doing that. But we also have to house people so that they're not being pushed into homelessness and into other bad situations.
Great, thank you for that answer. So another common theme that we've heard, and you mentioned it a little bit in your talk earlier, are tenant protections. Now, I imagine just like SB35 is rolled into a larger legislative package, that something similar might happen with SB50. Do you anticipate there being some kind of tenant protections passed in this year's legislative cycle?
I will cautiously say yes. SB50 is not in a vacuum. We need a full, well-rounded package. The zoning reform is part of that. There will be some sort of streamlining, and there are several streamlining bills that members are authoring. And by the way, SB50 is my only housing bill this year. I'm focusing on. I have a shelter bill too, to try to make sure we have more shelter beds for homeless people, but SB50 is my housing bill. We have multiple ADU bills this year. We have various affordable housing funding bills, and we do have an aggressive package of tenant protections. We have a proposal by Richard Bloom out of Santa Monica to reform Costa-Hawkins, not to repeal it. The voters rejected repeal by rejecting Prop 10, but to reform it so we don't have the arbitrary 1995 cutoff for rent control in California. Assemblyman David Chu is authoring a bill to put a rent gouging cap. We see people who are getting 20, 30, 40, 50, 100% rent increases in one fell swoop. This would cap that. We have several bills to create statewide just cause for eviction. We have a bill by Senator Holly Mitchell from LA that I'm co-authoring to ban discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders, which a number of cities already do, but we want to make sure that people who own Section 8 are able to actually find housing. We have a bill by Buffy Wicks out of the East Bay that will create a statewide rental registry so we can actually know what our rental situation is in California. And then Senator Nancy Skinner from the East Bay has a bill to help people stay in their apartments, particularly by increasing access to legal counsel. So that's a lay of the land of what's out there. I'm under no illusion that it's all going to pass in its pristine form. These bills are all really, really, really hard, but I am cautiously optimistic that at least some of them will pass in some negotiated form. Governor Newsom, both during the campaign and in his State of the State, he said, send me tenant legislation. And I think he will help broker some sort of negotiation. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get something good done for tenants this year.
Great, and we'll finish on this last question on an optimistic note. So what can we do, both as community members and as local elected leaders, to create a willingness to support more affordable housing and more housing in general?
I think it's really important just for people to be involved, people of all political views to be involved. And I think it's really hard. It's going to your local planning commission or city council, engaging with your elected officials. It takes a lot of time and energy, and we're all short on time. We're working and raising kids, and so it's challenging. But it's so important for us to hear from people. I tend to hear from a lot of people in housing just because I do a lot of this work, and people love me or hate me or somewhere in between. But for a lot of members who aren't necessarily right at the center of the housing debate, they're not always hearing from their constituents. They're only hearing from one side, because opposition and anger is a much more powerful motivation to engage, unfortunately, than, okay, I'm happy with what's happening. Happiness, unfortunately, it's nice to be happy, but happiness is less of a motivator to dive in and get involved and spend 5 hours at a planning commission hearing, or go and see your senator or assembly member and say, this is what I think. So I just think I'm being organized, and we have a lot of more organization. We have neighborhood associations and groups that take a certain perspective on development or other issues. We have the YIMBYs, and it's great for me, when people say, how can I want more housing, how can I get involved? You say, just go join your local YIMBY chapter. I didn't know what to tell them. You have more and more people who are involved in affordable housing organizations, whether it's nonprofits that build affordable housing or organizations that help people keep their housing. And just being involved and making your voice heard, as cliche as that sounds, it's incredibly important. Members of the legislature, in addition to city council members and mayors, believe me, we hear when people are rising up and saying, this is what I think. We hear it.
Great. Can everyone give a round of applause for Senator Wiener?